What if I told you that in just a few months, you're about to experience the final new generation of Pokemon with Scarlet and Violet?
Well, I can tell you what I think. I think you're pretty insane for thinking that. Pokemon is literally the highest grossing media franchise in history, generating nearly $120 billion in revenue since its 1996 release, and it's showing no signs of slowing down anytime soon.
I suppose you're not wrong. These games on their own still sell so well, and that's not even counting the anime and merch and all that. However, if you really look between the lines at gaming in general, whether it be for this franchise or any Nintendo property, there has certainly been a focus shifted toward mobile gaming, and I think that not even Pokemon can withstand this change in the landscape.
I get what you're saying, but when it comes to Pokemon, I just couldn't disagree more. But you know what? Let's settle this once and for all.
Why in the world would I want to do that? You're editing this video, and you can end up completely putting words in my...
Welcome to Version Exclusive, Special Prime Directive and Collector Dexter Edition.
Wow, that's a great graphic you just threw up for that voiceover. Are you sure this is like only our first video? We've had a popular meme noise already, some nice branding, and even hot topic keywords in the intro.
Well, when you have a rich benefactor, benefacting all of your projects and research, anything is possible.
Yeah, well, your projects and research turned me into a damn Kabutops. So I've got to say, not a huge fan of whoever your benefactor is. I'm only doing this until I get turned back into a person anyway. Then it's so long, sayonara, farewell, all of that. Whenever that may be.
Whoa there! Is that lore I hear coming out of your mandibles?
No, it's not. This is a mouth I have. I am not some sort of sick, gross bug monster. I am a person. Let's just talk about our disagreement from earlier, though. That's what the people are really here for. I do firmly believe that this upcoming 9th generation of the Pokemon franchise will be its final one, and I have a multitude of reasons as to why I believe that.
Well, I'm gonna need you to say what those reasons are, because I just don't see it, Prime.
Hey, listen, buddy. That's the Prime Directive to you. Though I'll give you the biggest reason why I feel that way. The fact that Game Freak will have over 1,000 Pokemon to work with after Scarlet and Violet come out. I don't really know the exact amount we're going to have, so it could even be pushing 1,100, who knows? I can't get in the mind of the developers over at Game Freak, and even if I could, I wouldn't be able to understand anything that they're saying because I only speak English, not Japanese. But I would have to assume that from the early days of the franchise, they might have only ever imagined getting a couple hundred Pokemon created, let alone a full 1,000. It's sort of like you've got more than enough Pokemon to recycle for many years to come, so that introducing more is just unnecessary. Plus, we've had regional variants since the 7th generation, and I have a bit of a theory that the whole reason this idea of them came about was to help make the player base get used to the idea of new forms of pre-existing Pokemon instead of whole new Pokemon in general. Quite frankly, I'd go as far as to say that it's the future of the franchise as a whole. New games that feature regional variants and maybe a handful of new legendaries, and that is it.
Well, I don't think you're inherently wrong with anything that you're saying. I don't think anyone could have anticipated Pokemon being as big as it became in the late 90s, and why would you stop that gravy train when it just started choo-chooing away? But here's the deal, just because they've introduced regional variants to the franchise to help mitigate the ever-expanding Pokedex from getting too large too quick does not mean that we're done getting new regions, a nice amount of brand new Pokemon, and the variety of gimmicks that we cycle through with each new generation. Personally, I feel 120 plus brand new Pokemon every 3 years was really unsustainable. You start to repeat concepts, thus making the new ones not as special anymore. Their first solution to that was of course Mega Evolutions, but those could get pretty broken, and ultimately, at the end of the day, only slightly altered their appearances. And then in comes regional variants. In my opinion, it is one of the most ingenious things that they could have added to the series. Undoubtedly, these forms were inspired by Darwin's finches, the idea that the same creature placed in a completely new environment would eventually evolve over the generations in order to survive, which is exactly what these forms of Pokemon had to do. It just works so well from a lore perspective, an actual scientific perspective, and most importantly, a money-making perspective. The base of the design already exists, so it saves time in that department, and just the profitability behind a brand new form for somebody's favorite, or soon to be brand new favorite Pokemon is just remarkable. Which just brings my ramble to this point. Why would they stop creating brand new Pokemon just for the sake of it? I mean, I could maybe understand them perhaps going even lower than the 70 to 80 a generation that we're used to now, but to outright just stop brand new Pokemon in favor of variants of existing Pokemon just seems a little sir-fetched to me.
Obviously, I agree with your thought process of regional variants being this big ingenious thing that the team at Game Freak came up with, though your response to my theory almost sold me on it even more. When they're out here repeating concepts and whatnot anyway, why not just settle into the fact that while there are still plenty of ideas you could come up with for new Pokemon, you could just focus in on making variants of the ones you already have taking the position of actual new Pokemon. That's not to say there won't be some legendary Pokemon still that are new, or mythicals, and maybe there can be a couple of new evolutions with a new game's release, like Ursaluna or Kleavor in Legends Arceus. Here's where I think my thought process might be getting misconstrued with people, though. I think we've seen our final new generation, but not the final region. Aside from new actual Pokemon, what's the other thing that people most look forward to in a Pokemon game? The new mechanic and the region itself. They can easily continue this franchise one way or another by using the existing Pokemon to populate an all-new region. As a matter of fact, I think that Game Freak can get by never introducing another new region, if they really wanted to. They proved with Gold and Silver that returning to an old region is very possible, and can be pretty fun too. The new Kanto region in those games and their remakes featured a couple new gym leaders and big-time changes to some locales like Cinnabar Island. We're entering some uncharted territory here, as by the time Scarlet and Violet release, we will be introduced to our 9th region. There are a few games that have 9 different countries, essentially, that are fully fleshed out and offer something new every time you visit them, and sometimes entirely new characters and ideas when they're revisited. Don't you think that at this point, we might be nearing a reality where Game Freak doesn't need to worry about entirely new locations, and instead just updating and changing what we already know?
No, you are right. There really are very few games that can offer the amount of worlds and beloved characters that Pokemon offers today, and clearly Game Freak is taking the initiative in revisiting past regions. But if old El Paso Taco Kids have taught me anything growing up, why not have both? We can have our games that let us revisit those old regions with just a handful of new forms, and the games that bring us the large Pokedex, new world, and just everything that we've grown accustomed to over the last 25 years or so. In fact, I'd love the idea of a new region with just returning Pokemon being present, with a core focus on brand new characters and their story, like what the Colosseum series did. But I don't think that opinion represents the masses. So Legends Arceus, for example, while being a really fun game, it is pretty limited in what it can offer to the fanbase. We got a handful of new forms, brand new evolutions for those forms, and even a new legendary Pokemon in Enamorus. Sure, it sold well, standing at 12.64 million as of writing this, likely making its way into the Nintendo Switch's top 10 in just a few months. But there's no way that game is ever going to outsell Sword and Shield. You know, the game's littered with controversy and that massive boycott that still resulted in them being the second best-selling games in the franchise. At the end of the day, all Legends could offer outside of its few new Pokemon were world exploration and story. These, of course, are two major components in what can make a Pokemon game great, but I'd argue that the vast majority of players are there for the new Pokemon. And sure, Game Freak does have to repeat the core of some concepts, like your bird, bug, and rodent-based Pokemon, but are we really going to sit here and say that Morpeko should have just been a Galarian Pikachu instead? Sure, Scarlet and Violet could have a regional variant of Dustox and base it off of the Venezuelan Poodle Moth, changing its typing, and calling it a day. But no matter what, these regional variants have to keep the Pokemon they're based off of in line with the original design, which I think would really stifle the creativity behind the creation process as a whole in the long run if they were truly to do that.
Alright, that's a fair point to make. The creatives at Game Freak might not feel as fulfilled as they could be when there's maybe just some new evolutions and a couple of legendaries introduced with every new game. And you know, the rest of the new ideas are just variants of existing Pokemon. I definitely can agree that it would potentially be an issue, but does it overly matter to them as much as we think it does? Recently, Game Freak lost both Junichi Masuda and James Turner, one leaving for greener pastures, while the other decided to take a more broad-scoped position in the franchise. Those are two big names in the franchise's nearly 3 decades of dominance, But I think it's fair to say that if there weren't trusted people there to replace them, and then those who will have to replace their replacements, that it may not have happened. This is a franchise that is already going through a big change right now in its art direction, and is entering an Omori-only future in the immediate when it comes to directing. Now, that's a lot of change to sort of come together all at once, though we shouldn't kid ourselves too much. Scarlet and Violet were obviously in development long before either of those guys stepped away from the company. But could that lend itself to my thought process even more? There's change coming, and while we might be hardcore fans of the series and have other sorts of expectations judging off the past, how can we be sure? There's so much money still being made by these games. You mentioned some of those numbers earlier with the Switch releases. There's reason to believe that the detractors who are boycotting Sword and Shield were so massively in the minority of things, but is there also reason to believe that fans like you and I are also part of a minority? Perhaps the people who go into Pokemon looking for new creatures and stuff like that are also just as inconsequential to the franchise's success. I think that they could definitely release, let's say, Pokemon Up and Pokemon Down in a whole new region and include around 450 of the already existing Pokemon alongside perhaps 24 regional variants and just a few legendaries, and they would sell as well as anything else. The only people who'd be coming out of that disappointed are guys like us, while the majority of the people who buy their games will do so because they are Pokemon games, and that's it. The fact of the matter is that 3/4 of Pokemon's revenue comes from merchandising, whether that be from the fruit snacks you buy at the grocery store, or the Pokemon branded concrete that some construction company in South Korea purchases by the ton. It's not the games that bring in the most money at this point, it's the merch. Their continued success will only help Pokemon grow as a brand, of course, but at this point I don't think they need to create many more at all and can rely on their 1,000 strong roster to be marketable, meaning that Game Freak can continue to have Pokemon be their big series while also completely focusing in on any changes to gameplay they want, and of course the storytelling.
Yeesh, you really brought up a lot of stuff there, so I'll try to condense my thoughts down a bit so we don't overwhelm the audience too much. Yes, we do have some key people leaving in the company and some changes to be expected with that, but I don't think that means that the franchise changes at its core. Pokemon is a third owned by Game Freak, Nintendo, and Creatures Inc., meaning they all equally get a say at the direction that it moves in. And, to the chagrin of some, Pokemon hasn't fundamentally changed all too much since its inception. We've also seen major shifts in leadership before Masuda-san and James Turner took their leaves, with the likes of Sugimori-san taking a supervisor role in recent years, as well as Tajiri-san, the series' creator, taking more of a backseat role starting back in 2006 with Diamond and Pearl. Now, getting to your point of game sales and fans like you and I being in the minority of who actually buys the game, of course, I cannot say with absolute certainty that the majority who buy are specifically coming in for new Pokemon, but a quick look at sales I believe will help me paint a better picture. The top 8 best-selling Pokemon games of all time just so happen to be the beginning of a new generation with the dozens of new Pokemon that come with them. The next 5 being remakes, Pokemon Yellow, then Legends Arceus, Fire Red and Leaf Green, and then rounding it out with the enhanced versions. Do you see what I'm getting at? In your Pokemon Up and Down scenario, you can see that it will sell big bucks, but it's basically what Legends Arceus was, maybe to a slightly grander extent, and yet it won't even likely come close to the sales of games that the internet told you ruined the franchise. The new stuff sells, plain and simple. Of course, everything else does as well, but no one can deny the significance between the amounts. Now we have the majority of the revenue point, being that it comes mostly from merchandising. Yeah, that's true, but again, what is going to help new merchandise being pushed more than the loads of new stuff brought to the forefront of the new games? The new games create the foundation for everything else around it. Your plushies, your fruit snacks, your fire-type Pokemon Letterman jacket. New forms will still push merchandise, no doubt, but the shiny, brand new stuff will always reign supreme in my opinion.
I'll say this much in response to your claim about my up and down games. At the very least, that'll be 2 games going into the equation instead of just the one that Arceus was. That's gotta mean more money for sure, right? Anyway, what I will say in regards to merch, I think it's a little wild to think brand new stuff always reigns supreme when Pikachu, Charizard, and all of the other starter Pokemon have non-stop just been pushed as the faces of the majority of US products for Pokemon, and a fair deal of them outside of the Japanese market. However, those few points weren't what resonated with me the most from what you just said, Dex. No, It was the part about Nintendo and Game Freak and Creatures all having a say in the direction of the franchise. Obviously, Creatures is all in on developing stuff for Pokemon at this point and assisting Game Freak in doing so, but I do think the market in general is moving towards mobile gaming. I think ports of Pokemon games finding their way to mobile devices is for sure going to happen eventually, and that a lot of the franchise could see itself being turned into games like Pokemon Cafe Mix and Masters as opposed to main console releases. Now, we're years from that happening, I think, but I do believe the changes in video games in general are showing us that's really a possibility. Plus, here's one thing I think that's really important. Yeah, these games definitely always sell well no matter what. What I believe is probably overlooked, though, is the fact that these games were all the first releases for a console, mostly. Technically, Sword and Shield wasn't the first set of Switch Pokemon games, and that was the Let's Go releases. Though when you look at most of these new generations, they would come as the first Pokemon games on new hardware. They were new regions, new hardware, and had a new Pokemon on their box art. Who's to say that those three aren't the main factors that drive people to check out these new games as opposed to just having new Pokemon?
Well, just so I'm not misconstrued, I do want to say that of course the likes of Pikachu and Charizard will seemingly always be popular, but I really believe that if they were the only faces a franchise offered over the last 2.5 decades, then the franchise wouldn't have been nearly as successful in the long run. Of course we have a lot of new Pokemon now to hold the fort down for a while, but thinking of how your business is going to last in the long run is the most important thing in that world. Sword and Shield didn't sell gangbusters just because of Gigantamax Kanto starters, it sold that well because of the large amount of new and old offerings. But again, I'll hold firm that if we just get the same 1,000 Pokemon recycled in every game going forward with minimal new offerings outside of story and world exploration, Pokemon would probably see a sizable spike downwards in terms of sales. As for mobile games, yeah, the market as a whole is tending to skew towards the freemium model, and it can work quite well. But let's be honest here, the only Pokemon game using that model that has found groundbreaking success was Pokemon Go. Masters EX, a respectable 75 million in its first year, but Pokemon Go, you're looking at roughly $1 billion a year, even today. Of course they would want to try and recapture that, but nothing has so far, and I highly doubt anything ever will. In fact, Nintendo in general has had issues in the mobile gaming sphere as it's just not something they're particularly passionate about, and that's not just okay, that's appreciated. But then hitting on your last point there, yeah, typically speaking, the first game on the new console happens to be a new generation more often than not. But, as you said, one of the exceptions to this was Let's Go and Sword and Shield. Let's Go is the highest selling remake in the franchise, an impressive feat for sure. But the fact that it couldn't be the highest selling game on the Switch despite coming a year earlier while also targeting the Pokemon Go audience and really hitting those nostalgia chords as hard as they could, it just wasn't enough. Now, of course, I'm aware that Scarlet and Violet could very well sell way under what Sword and Shield did, despite being a major step forward for the franchise that many of the fans wanted to see. But I think that'll just come from the fact that there's a healthy saturation of Pokemon games available on the Switch, and the fact that its lifespan is approaching its end within the next couple of years. I guess time will just have to tell with this one, and we'll probably just have to agree to disagree. But I'll end us off by invoking a classic phrase. If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Alright, Dex, I'll say this much. What you've had to say has definitely changed my way of thinking. I do still believe we're coming to the end of Pokemon as we know it, but perhaps we will see a proper 10th generation after all. I can't imagine they can keep it going much longer, and still believe in a lot of my points as to why not, but you've for sure given me, and our great viewers, a lot to think about.
Well, you know, I've got to say, Prime, I've lost all respect for you, and quite frankly, I hope you stay in that Kabutops body forever.
What?
Of course, I jest. We all have our own opinions, and as long as we stay respectful to each other, there's no harm in debating them. But you know what I'm curious about? What did you all think? Whether there's one of you,
or a bajillion of you,
we'd love to hear your thoughts on this down below. With that said, I'm Collector Dexter.
And I'm the Prime Directive.
And we hope to see you again real soon.